Texas, 1882. The sun hung like a blood-orange coin above the town of Bramble's Edge, its last heat boiling off the rooftops and cracking the dirt beneath booth heels. The autumn air was dry as gunpowder and twice as flammable. Dust clung to coat hems and mustaches, and the smell of sweat, horses, and wood smoke curled into the spaces between voices. The final auction of the season had dwindled to a handful of lean cattle, 2 half-broke mules, and 1 woman. She stood beneath the sheriff's platform, dressed in blue gingham, faded nearly to gray. Her hair was twisted into a bun, crooked but careful, and her hands hung like soft stones at her sides. Her boots had no laces. Her cheeks were flushed with shame, not sun. She was not young in the way the crowd expected, not slender or shy or blushing, but something older than her years, like weathered timber too thick to burn. "She's too big to keep and too proud to starve," said the man beside her, flicking his spittoon-stained fingers toward her shoulder like she was a dog that wouldn't heel. "Bidding starts at $10, or I'll haul her to Galveston for brothel meat. Either way, she's off my hands." Laughter rose sharp and mean. Calder Reddick shifted his weight on the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, face unreadable beneath the shadow of his brim. 42, a man of few words and fewer friends. Calder had buried a wife 3 winters ago and hadn't spoken a full sentence in public since. He'd only come into town for nails and molasses, but lingered now beside the blacksmith's post, hands rough with calluses, eyes trained on the auction block. He hadn't meant to look at her, but something in her stillness kept drawing his gaze, like a bell with no clapper that still rang in your bones. She wasn't crying, wasn't begging, wasn't pleading with her eyes like some did when the rope around their freedom grew tight. She just stood there, chin high, like she'd already survived worse. "Name's Lenora Bell Wyatt," her seller said to no one. "But don't let that fool you. She ain't fancy, just fat. Eats too much. Don't work hard. Don't do nothing but take up space and judge the rest of us." Her eyes flicked, not to the speaker, but across the crowd, resting briefly on Calder. Her gaze held him for just a moment. Not a challenge, not a plea, just recognition. The way a lone wolf might recognize another who walks without a pack. Calder turned his head, but couldn't make himself look away. $10, barked the auctioneer. Silence. 10, do I hear 10? Nothing. A child giggled. A woman hissed, "Lord have mercy." 8 then, the seller snapped. 5, if it gets her out of my damn shed." A man in suspenders laughed. "You gonna throw in a pie to sweeten the deal?" More laughter. Calder exhaled through his nose. His hands curled slightly, like he was gripping reins, though there were none. 5, someone muttered mockingly. He stepped forward. His boots struck the packed clay like punctuation. "I'll take her," he said, his voice sand-dry but steady. The laughter cracked in half. Every eye turned. "You serious?" The seller blinked. "I said I'll take her," Calder repeated, already drawing out the coins. Sheriff Garrison tipped his hat back, chewing a toothpick. "You sure, Reddick? Woman like that ain't exactly." "She's not livestock," Calder said. That ended the talk. He dropped the coins in the man's outstretched palm for silver dollars and 2 halves, enough to buy seed for spring or a bolt of good wool. The man didn't thank him, just spit, turned, and walked away. Lenora hadn't moved. "You coming?" Calder asked, glancing at her only once before heading toward his wagon. She followed, one hand gathering the sides of her skirt, the other pressed lightly to her stomach like she was trying to hold something in, grace, maybe, or shame. He helped her up onto the bench. She didn't thank him, but she didn't flinch either. They rode through the town's main street under the gaze of every window and doorway. Children stopped their hoop-rolling. Women clutched their parasols like holy relics. When they reached the outer fence posts of Bramble's Edge, Lenora finally spoke, voice soft as worn velvet. "You don't know me. I know you're tired of standing in dirt while men pretend you're worth less than it," he said. She didn't answer, just folded her hands in her lap and looked out at the golden grass flickering in the dying light. His ranch sat beyond 3 ridges and a dry creek, past mesquite groves and wind-worn cottonwoods. It wasn't much, one main house with a sloped porch, a barn with a swayback roof, and 3 outbuildings slowly giving into gravity. But the air was clean. The quiet was deep. And for men like Calder, that had always been enough. He handed her down from the wagon. She paused, fingers resting on the rail. Then she walked to the porch and stood there, waiting. Not like a guest. Not like a wife. Like a woman trying to decide if survival had a second chapter. Inside, the kitchen smelled of smoke and coffee grounds. Calder lit the lamp and pointed to a chair. She sat. He stoked the stove and set a kettle on. "Dinner simple," he said. "But hot." She nodded. Her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the table, nails short but clean. They ate in near silence. Cornbread, beans, 2 strips of bacon he'd saved for guests he never had. She chewed slow, measured, as if tasting meant something again. After supper, he poured her a tin cup of coffee. She accepted it with both hands, the cup looking small against her palms. Then she did something that stopped him cold. She smiled. Just a flicker. Just for a second. But real. And it undid him in a quiet, aching way. "You have a room," he said. "Back of the hall. If you want it." "I want it." He nodded once and stood. Before disappearing into his own room, he paused and turned back. "You'll find a basin. And a fresh quilt. It was my wife's. She wouldn't mind." Lenora looked up, eyes glossy but dry. "Thank you." He went to bed and lay staring at the dark beams overhead. The house felt different already, warmer, maybe, or heavier. Not bad. Just full. At some point he heard footsteps soft as feathers on the floorboards. Then silence again. In the morning, when he woke and came to the kitchen, the stove was already warm, and the smell of fresh biscuits curled up to meet him like forgiveness. She was standing at the counter, back turned, hair loose down her spine. He didn't speak, just sat down. She placed a plate before him and poured coffee, then sat across from him, her face calm and unreadable. But something in her had changed. She wasn't waiting anymore. Not for permission. Not for pity. Not even for love. Just for a place to put her hands. He reached for the biscuit. Took a bite. Chewed. Looked at her. "You make more like this," he said, "and I might never let you leave." She didn't smile. But her shoulders eased. Her breath deepened. And, in that quiet, they began something neither one dared name. Not yet. But it had started. Right there in blue gingham and dust. Lenora rose before the rooster. Not from obligation, not from fear, but because her body had long been trained by duty no one praised. The farmhouse held its breath in those first pale hours, floorboards quiet, wind whispering against the shutters. She moved barefoot, careful not to wake him. The kettle hissed low on the stove, and she found flour and lard in the pantry, her fingers knowing what to do without asking permission. Biscuits first, then eggs. She wiped the counters clean, swept the corners, polished the iron skillet with salt and rag. The ranch was quieter than she expected. No barking dogs, no slammed doors. Just creaking wood and the far-off murmur of hooves in pasture. She liked it that way. Silence, she'd found, could be a sanctuary when it wasn't laced with shame. By the time Calder stepped into the kitchen, hat in hand, sleeves rolled, boots damp with dew, the table was set, and the biscuit sat in a cloth-lined bowl, steam curling up like prayer. He paused in the doorway, eyes trailing over the scene with the caution of a man who didn't expect grace. Then he sat wordless and reached for one, bit in, chewed slow. "Good," he muttered. She waited, unsure if that was the extent of it. It was. The next morning he asked, same again. She gave a quiet nod. And so it began. He worked outside most days, fence repairs, tending to the pair of horses, chopping wood. She watched through the window, sometimes stepping out to offer water. He'd take the glass, nod, sip, return it with a simple thank you. The kind that wasn't performative, but real. A man raised to speak only when needed. And somehow, that made his few words feel like stones laid on solid ground. One afternoon, she followed him to the barn. The hens were wild, the coop in disrepair. She gathered the scattered eggs, laughing when one rolled off and cracked at her feet. He looked over, puzzled. "I wasn't laughing at you," she said, blushing. "I didn't think you were. You look like you thought I'd lost my mind." "I thought maybe you'd finally found it," he replied. A pause. Then she smiled. That was their way, brief exchanges that hinted at something deeper without demanding it. Days passed in a rhythm, not quite harmony, but something like it. She mended shirts, not because he asked, but because the frayed cuffs bothered her. He fixed the back steps she nearly fell through. She stitched a new pillowcase for the parlor. He brought her a shawl from the chest upstairs when the wind turned colder. There was one night when a storm came, shaking the windows, rattling the roof. She stood at the kitchen window, hands tight around a mug, watching lightning fracture the sky. Calder appeared beside her without announcement. "Don't like storms," she said softly. "No one does," he replied. "I used to sit in the cellar in the dark. My stepbrother said I took up too much room in the house when it rained." He said nothing, just stood with her until the thunder moved on. The next day, she found a lantern left on her nightstand, bright, full of oil. The townsfolk hadn't seen her since the auction. Not until Calder needed supplies, and she asked to come along. He hesitated, then nodded. Dry Creek hadn't changed. The clapboard buildings, the church bell, the ever-watching eyes. As they walked down the main street, arms not linked, but steps matching, voices rose around them like brushfire. "She's living with him now. Poor June's hardly cold in the ground. He could have had anyone. She looks like she swallowed the cook." They didn't say a word. Calder bought flour, nails, a new pail. Lenora waited by the general store, her back straight, her eyes forward. Then came Hetty Swain, all ribbons and teeth, fanning herself as if the world depended on her judgment. "Well now," she said, eyeing Lenora's figure. "You do make a presence." Lenora turned slowly. "Good morning, Miss Swain. I was just saying, it's kind of Calder to take you in. He's always had a generous spirit. Some might call it pity, but I say it's charity." Before Lenora could answer, Calder stepped between them. "She cooks. She cleans. She's kind. She earns her keep. That's more than I can say for half the mouths in this town." Hetty's lips thinned. "She's mine," he added, eyes steady. Lenora looked down, not in shame, but to hide the heat rising in her face. It wasn't ownership that stirred her chest. It was the way he said it, not like a man boasting, like a man naming a truth. They rode home in silence. But the silence wasn't heavy. It felt shared. That evening, he asked if she'd sit on the porch with him. 2 rocking chairs. A small table between them. The sky streaked orange and pink, and the cottonwoods whispered. "Wasn't trying to make a scene," he said. "I know. I meant it, though." "I know," she whispered. They didn't speak again for an hour. Just watched the dusk settle. One morning, Calder found her struggling to lift a bucket at the well. He walked over, took it from her, filled it, and set it at her feet. "You ain't meant to break yourself on chores." "I'm not fragile. I didn't say you were. But you don't have to prove anything here." She looked up at him. "What if I want to?" He tilted his head. "Then do it. But for yourself." That night, she pulled her old blue dress from the trunk. It still bore the dust of that auction day, but it had been hers once, truly hers. She scrubbed it clean, mended the torn hem, ironed it carefully. Not for anyone else's eyes. For her own. When she stepped out wearing it the next morning, Calder glanced over his shoulder. A flicker passed across his face. Not surprise. Not delight. Recognition. "You look like someone who's finally home," he said. She didn't know what to do with that. So she just said, "Thank you," and poured his coffee. The house began to shift in small ways. He put fresh linens on the guest bed without her asking. She painted the front door. He fixed the loose shutter. She planted marigolds. They didn't speak of these things, they simply did them, like stones being placed one by one to build something sturdier. There was one moment late in the week when Calder sat by the fireplace, boots off, reading a torn paperback novel. She stepped in quietly, folding towels. "You ever miss her?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Every day." She nodded. "But missing her doesn't mean there's no room left." That was all he said, and she carried that sentence with her like a candle into every dark part of herself. One afternoon, Calder returned from town with a wooden crate. Inside, fresh yeast, cinnamon, and 2 enamel mugs with red rims. She stared at them, puzzled. "Saw him in the window," he said. "Figured we could use nicer things." I don't drink alone anymore." He didn't have to say it. She felt it. A place was forming for her here, not as a tenant, not as a charity, but as someone seen. When she knelt to tie her boot the next day, he leaned over, brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Not possessive, not flirty, just a gesture that said, "I see you." That night, she couldn't sleep. She went out onto the porch in her shawl. Stars scattered thick across the sky. Calder was there already, cradling a cup of warm milk. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said. "You didn't." They sat together again. No words, just the quiet creak of wood and the distant call of an owl. After a while, she said, "They still stare in town." He nodded. "They stared when I married June, too. She was sick for years. Said I was wasting my youth." "And were you?" "No. I loved her. Would have done it twice." Lenora pulled her shawl tighter. "I never been loved. Not like that." He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Maybe you haven't been seen either. That's different." She turned to him, searching. "I see you," he said. The wind shifted. The stars seemed closer. In the days that followed, the silence between them grew warmer, easier. She caught him watching her while she kneaded bread. He caught her folding his shirt with more care than was strictly necessary. Nothing was declared, but everything was building. One evening, he reached for her hand as she passed him a bowl of stew. Not long, just a touch, just enough. And, in that touch, a promise without pressure, a seed. Lenora went to bed that night with her hand pressed to her heart. There was no kiss, no dramatic confession, just 2 people, worn but willing, moving toward something neither dared name, but both had started to believe in. She drifted off to sleep hearing the creak of his chair outside, steady, like a heartbeat. A man who didn't speak much, but said everything she needed without opening his mouth. The sky cracked open before supper. A sickle of cloud coiled above the ridge, low and gray, and the light went strange green-tinted, like the world had gone underwater. Calder glanced up from where he was tightening the barn gate, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and muttered, "She's coming fast." Lenora was already moving without being asked. She gathered the clothes from a line, pins between her teeth, skirt whipped by the rising wind. Thunder rumbled low, like a warning growl in a deep chest. She'd known storms, plenty of them. But this one felt different. This one felt close. They reached the barn at nearly the same moment. Rain began as a whisper on the tin roof, then a slap, then a roar. Calder latched the heavy door behind them, lantern in hand. The horses stomped nervously, hooves clattering. Wind howled through the cracks in the beams. He lit the lantern and set it on a hook. "Should pass by midnight," he said, adjusting the wick. Lenora stood by the haystack, soaked to the knees. Her hair, usually pinned, had come loose in the sprint, strands clinging to her cheek. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes flicked toward the corner of the barn, dark, quiet. "A place to wait. Best we stay put," he said. "House ain't built for this kind of wind." She nodded, pulled her shawl tighter, and sat on an overturned bucket. The lantern threw long shadows on the wood. For a long while, the only sound was the drumming of rain and the occasional shifting of horses. Then Calder sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. He studied the dirt between his boots. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, thoughtful. "You don't talk about before." Her breath caught. "Before what?" "Before here." She ran a hand over her skirt, eyes on the swinging lantern. "Not much worth telling." "I reckon there is." Silence again. Not sharp, just waiting. She glanced up at him. In the flickering light, he looked younger, somehow. Less stone, more skin. "I was 13 when my mama died," she began. "She was soft-spoken like you. Played hymns on a cracked fiddle, and told me I had a heart too big for my own good." Calder didn't interrupt. "Rufus, he's my stepbrother, you remember, he took the house. Took everything. Said a girl my size couldn't live off pity, forever. Started weighing my meals, locking the pantry. Said I was too round to ever marry. Calder's jaw flexed once, a muscle twitching. When I turned 18, he tried to marry me off to a man twice my age. I refused. Got locked in the woodshed 3 days. After that, I learned to say yes, sir, without meaning it. Her voice cracked slightly, but she smoothed it over. I left once. Had a plan. Saved up sewing for neighbors. Got as far as Cedar Creek before he caught me. Sold the mule I rode in on. Dragged me back. She smiled, bitter and small. The auction was the only time he ever advertised me kindly. She expected pity. Instead, she got quiet. I'm sorry, Calder said at last. You didn't do it. Still. She looked at him. Why'd you take me, Calder? Really? The question hung between them like smoke. He met her eyes. Because you looked like you hadn't been given a choice in a long time. Figured maybe it was time you got one. A bolt of lightning forked the sky. Thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the lantern. She flinched, then cursed herself for it. Calder rose slowly, crossed to her, and reached out his hand. She hesitated, then took it. He pulled her up, guided her to the stack of hay bales along the wall, and motioned for her to sit. He sat beside her. The storm screamed around them, wild and feral. But inside the barn, it felt like the eye of something. Still, and strangely holy. I used to think if I just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, maybe someone would see past what I looked like, she whispered. And did they? No. They just praised how quiet I was. She looked down at her hands, fingers thick and calloused, but steady. You see me? She asked. His answer was simple. Yes. She turned toward him. He was close, his shoulder brushing hers, the warmth of him steadying. I miss her sometimes, he said, voice barely above the sound of rain. June. She died in childbirth. Baby didn't make it, either. I'm sorry, she said. Me too. Another silence, softer this time. The kind that asked nothing, but offered everything. I made the ranch a tomb after that, he continued. Stopped speaking to neighbors. Buried my joy with her. Thought I was being loyal. But what I really was alone. She nodded. Grief makes shrines of all the wrong things. He looked at her. You talk like a preacher. No, just a woman who spent too many nights talking to no one. He reached out, gently brushed a strand of damp hair from her cheek. The touch was tentative, almost reverent. She didn't pull away. You're not no one, he said. She swallowed hard. I don't know how to be anything else. Then we'll find out together. His hand lingered just a moment too long before retreating. The air between them shimmered with something unsaid, but not unfelt. Outside, the storm began to soften. The rain slowed to a murmur, the thunder moving off toward the hills. The horses settled. The barn breathed easier. They sat together in the fading lantern glow, her fingers grazing his as they rested between them. He didn't kiss her. That would have been too fast, too easy. Instead, he said, you can leave tomorrow. Or you can stay. Either way, I won't own you. But if you stay, I'll stand with you. You'll never have to fight your ghosts alone again. She looked at him, at the man who didn't flinch at her softness, who didn't speak just to fill space, who didn't promise things he hadn't weighed first. What if I stay? She asked slowly, but not as your maid. He met her eyes. Then stay as mine. The words settled around them like fresh hay, earthy, warm, and full of promise. In the quiet that followed, she rested her head on his shoulder, just for a moment. He didn't move. When the lantern flickered out, neither of them lit it again. They just sat in the dark, listening to the soft hush of rain washing the dust clean. The spring harvest fair arrived with banners snapping in the breeze and children chasing each other through dust and sunshine. Dry Creek stirred to life with the self-importance of a town that had little else to look forward to. Pies were lined on church tables. Livestock wore blue ribbons. And the townsfolk, dressed finer than they had in months, gathered like crows to corn, ready for the pageantry and, more so, for the gossip. Calder Reddick rode in beside Lenora on his buckboard wagon just after noon. She wore a moss-green dress she'd sewn herself, fitted close at the bodice, loose and practical through the skirt. Her hair was pinned with care. She carried herself not like someone trying to impress, but like someone who no longer apologized for taking up space. The whispers started before the wagon stopped. Is that her? Lord above, she actually came. She's bold, I'll give her that. Hetty Swain's voice cut through the murmurs like a sharpened fan. Well, ain't that sweet? She even ironed it. Lenora heard every word. She kept her gaze ahead. Calder stepped down first, then turned to offer his hand. She hesitated just a blink, then took it. When her boots touched the packed dirt of the fairground, it felt like stepping onto a stage built for the wrong play. She held her chin high. The sun was bright, the sky blue-washed and endless, but tension curled beneath the air. Townsfolk who had once looked through her now looked at her, some with pity, others with open derision. She felt their stares crawl over her skin, their minds trying to make sense of what they saw. Calder Reddick, the respected widower rancher, and the woman he chose. They passed the pie table. Miss Temple gave a cautious nod. Sheriff Garrison watched from under his hat brim, unreadable. Lenora exhaled slowly. It's like walking through fire. You're doing just fine, Calder murmured. You ever regret bringing me home? His stride didn't break. Every day I don't, which is all of M. They wandered for a while, watching the calf roping, inspecting saddles carved with care, sampling cornbread with pepper jam. But the dance was what the town waited for. The center of the fair, both in space and spectacle. Fiddlers tuned strings behind the platform. Children ran in circles near the hay bales. And all around, the whispers sharpened like knives being honed on stone. Hetty Swain made her approach after the second song, smile tight as lace. Well, if it isn't the new Mrs. Reddick, she said sweetly, loud enough to carry. You sure do fill that dress, honey. Took 2 bolts of cloth. The laughter that followed was small and mean. It scratched at Lenora's skin like thornbrush. Her hands curled slightly at her sides. But before she could answer, Calder stepped between them. Not aggressive, not loud, just present. She fills my life better than silence ever did, he said calmly. And better than gossip ever will. Gasps followed, audible and delicious. Even Hetty stepped back, caught off guard. Lenora blinked. Heat bloomed in her chest, not from shame, but from something fierce and bright. She ain't yours to ridicule, Calder added. She's mine to honor. Hetty said nothing more. She turned, heels sharp in the dirt, and retreated like smoke after a fire loses wind. The dance caller called for partners. A reel. A waltz. Calder turned to her. May I? She stared at his hand, then at the circle of onlookers. She could feel the heat of every eye on her, every held breath, every judgment waiting to be written in permanent ink. You sure? I'd like to dance with my wife, he said. More than I'd like to eat or sleep today. A pause. Then she stepped forward and placed her hand in his. Gasps again. Then silence. A space cleared on the dusty ground. The music began. Calder's hand settled against the small of her back. Gentle, steady, firm. She placed hers on his shoulder, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. He led her into the steps, slow, deliberate, matching the fiddle's waltz. At first, the murmurs buzzed like flies. But something happened. Lenora moved with grace. Not dainty, not rehearsed, but sure. Her weight shifted in time, her chin lifted, her gaze steady on Calder's. Her dress swayed, and the dust rose beneath her boots like the start of something sacred. She smiled, and it wasn't shy or forced. It was a knowing smile, the kind that says, I see you watching, and I no longer care. The music swelled. Calder spun her once, carefully, and when she landed back in step, there was clapping. One pair of hands at first, then more. A ripple of applause that chased away the sneers. By the end of the song, Lenora was glowing, not with pride, but with peace. They bowed to the caller, then walked away without a word. The town parted before them. Under the cottonwoods by the edge of the fairground, they sat on an old bench near the corral. Lenora looked down at her boots, still caked in fairground dust. I feel like I just climbed out of something heavy, she said, like shedding an old skin. You did. They'll still talk. Let M, Calder said. You danced like you were made to. She looked at him. Why didn't you kiss me out there? In front of them. He smiled faintly. Didn't want to make it about them. She nodded slowly. You were right. They stayed there until the light turned golden and the shadows long. She leaned into his shoulder, not out of exhaustion, but out of choice. Later that evening, they rode home slow, the wagon creaking beneath them. A quiet ride. Peaceful. At the ranch, Calder helped her down. She lingered near the porch while he tied off the horses. When he returned, she pointed to the side of the house. That's where I want it. What? A swing. A real one. I want to sit and read and drink coffee in the wind. He studied the spot. Done. She smiled. I'll build it next week. No, she said, teasing. Tomorrow. He laughed. A short surprise sound. Bossy. Better get used to it. The next morning, there was a hammering at sunrise. By afternoon, the swing hung beneath the eaves, sanded smooth, wide enough for two. He handed her the first cup of coffee to christen it. They sat side by side, the breeze cool and sweet, the scent of cedar rising with it. That evening, she brought out a book and read to him, her voice steady, soothing. He didn't care what story it was, only that it was her telling it. When the sun dipped below the ridge and the sky flushed rose, Calder leaned back and sighed. You saved me, he said quietly. No, she replied, laying her hand atop his. I just waited long enough to save myself. You gave me the place to do it. The swing rocked gently. Stars emerged like lanterns strung across a great barn roof. And somewhere in the distance, the fair still echoed with music and dust. But here, beneath the wooden eaves of a life they built with patience and small kindnesses, the only sound that mattered was the quiet exhale of two people who had been unseen for too long, now fully known. The world hadn't changed. The town would still gossip. The days would still be hard. But Lenora no longer braced herself for the storm. She had learned to dance in the dust, and beside her sat a man who knew how to hold her steady through every step.